On the AP English language exam from the College Board, probably the thing that will control your score on your timed writings more than anything else is analysis. You have to have that line of reasoning from the rubric, but analysis can go right along with that line of reasoning. In fact, that line of reasoning could be analytical. And so it's important to have as much depth in your analysis as possible. It's important to be as unique in your analysis as possible. And it's important to get away from simple summary as analysis. I do think that summary is a stage of analysis because you are at least paraphrasing and putting things in your own words, which is somewhat analytical, but it is not analytical enough to get a qualifying score on the AP exam. So let's look at a very short poem by E. E. Cummings, and he would have never capitalized any of the letters in his name, so I feel bad doing that, but the Keynote program automatically capitalizes everything in that line. The red wheelbarrow. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. Now, this seems like such a simple poem, except that we've been studying it for 70 years, and we're still coming up with new interpretations of this poem all the time. So you might look at it and go, well, I could write that, but could you write it with as much depth as E. E. Cummings has? Would you think to use a word, for example, like glazed? Would you think to start the poem with so much depends upon? And so I think that there's a lot that you can say about this poem. So if I were to ask you to explicate this poem, if I were to ask you to explain the meaning of this poem, I would want you to do so. I would want you to interpret it with some depth. So first we have our shallow analysis. I'm going to go ahead and read this to you. Obviously, the poem takes place on a farm. The red wheelbarrow is an important tool for the farmer because he feeds the chickens with it, but it's been raining and the wheelbarrow is wet. Wheelbarrows are used to move heavy, loose objects like sand or chicken feed. Chickens are probably the most common animal found on farms. There's no quote from the poem, and that's not a rule that you need to have a quote from the poem, but this is just a really loose interpretation, and because there's no quotes from the poem, when you say things like chickens are probably the most common animal found on farms, well, where is that in the poem? If you can prove that with lines, then you've got better analysis. But what you really have here is a summary of the poem. This paragraph is not telling us anything that we can't pick up from just reading the poem. And that's a problem on the AP English language exam, because if this is all you can do, this is what everybody can do, and they are not going to give a qualifying score to what everybody can say about the poem. They're looking for something new, they're looking for something unique. So here's a middle tier analysis. We're just below the surface, and I do think that this is teetering. This paragraph would teeter on getting you college credit. I do think that it could, if it were backed up with some other really good paragraphs. It is morning in E. E. Cummings' poem, The Red Wheelbarrow. We know that because there is dew on the wet wheelbarrow. Cummings uses the word glaze to describe the rain that covers the wheelbarrow, which tells us that there isn't much dew and the wheelbarrow can still be put to use. So much depends upon it because the farmer uses it to feed the chickens, and since the chickens are the only animal mentioned in this poem, they must be the primary animal on the farm. Okay, so I think that this paragraph does a better job than the first paragraph of interpreting it, digs a little bit deeper into the poem. And it uses some words from the poem, wet, glazed, and so much depends upon, to justify the interpretations that this paragraph makes. For example, the same interpretation of the chickens being the primary animal on the farm is made in this paragraph, just like it was in the last paragraph, but there's a justification for that interpretation, and therefore I think that it holds up a little bit better. The focus on the word glazed and the fact that the reader was able to determine that it might be morning in the poem gives this interpretation the depth that the first summary interpretation did not have. So I thought it might be a good time to look at the red wheelbarrow again. And there's an image of depth, and we want to get as low, we want to get as far into that crater as we possibly can. But I thought it'd be a good idea to look at the poem again before we discover the last paragraph that I think has a lot of analysis in it. And I tried to write it so in a way that a high school junior or senior could actually write this paragraph, and I think this is very doable for most students. E. E. Cummings's poem The Red Wheelbarrow says so much with so few words. So much depends upon the red wheelbarrow because the farmer would use it to feed the chickens. However, because the wheelbarrow has a function and that function serves the chickens are the most important image in this poem, even though so much depends upon the red wheelbarrow. The farmer's living and probably his family's dinner depend upon the chickens. The farmer is also up very early in the morning because the wheelbarrow is still glazed with rainwater, the dew from the night before. If the farmer is up so close to dawn, we know that he is a hard worker with a challenging day of work ahead of him. So this picks up on the ideas in the second paragraph, but it takes some risks. So the first risk that it takes is that the chickens are actually the most important image in the poem, even though so much depends upon the red wheelbarrow. And the second risk that this interpretation takes is that the farmer is up close to dawn and has a challenging day of work ahead of him. Both of those things, though, both of those ideas, that the chickens are the most important thing in the poem and that the farmer has a challenging day of work ahead of him, all revolve around this image of the red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater. Because so much depends upon it, it points us to the chickens. And because the red wheelbarrow is in the poem and there are so few words and so few images in this poem, we can assume that the farmer is up to work and that the farmer has a challenging day ahead of him with lots to do, not just feeding the chickens, but all of the work that comes along with owning a farm. So here's our final slide, and I just took a picture that is, of course, 2D, but it looks pretty 3D and has some depth to it, and we want to get as far down that tunnel as we possibly can when we analyze things in our rhetorical analysis, lines from the passage in the rhetorical analysis essay, when we analyze our textual evidence for the argumentative, open-ended essay, and of course when we analyze the sources for the synthesis timed writing.